Atlanta Press Club Debates 2008, the race for the 12th Congressional District, is brought to you from Georgia Public Broadcasting. Here's the moderator for tonight's debate.
Good evening. I'm Denis O'Hare, political reporter for WXIA-TV in Atlanta, 11 Alive. Welcome to our 2008 election campaign debates, originating from the studios of GPB. Tonight's debate is organized by the Atlanta Press Club. And we also welcome the statewide audience of GPB's radio network, which is simulcasting this debate, and our online audience at gpb.org. Now, let's meet the candidates facing each other in the election for the 12th Congressional District. They are, in alphabetical order, John Barrow, the two-term Democratic Congressman from Georgia's 12th District, and John Stone, who was the former Deputy Chief of Staff and Communications Director for both the late U.S. Representative Charlie Norwood and former U.S. Representative Max Burns. Now, here's the format for tonight's debate. In the first round, each candidate will answer 2 questions from our 3 panelists. In the second round, the candidates ask each other 2 questions apiece. Each candidate will have time for rebuttal in this round. And in the third round, the panelists will continue questioning the candidates. And finally, each candidate will have 30 seconds to make a closing statement. Now, before we get started, let's meet our 3 panelists, selected by the Atlanta Press Club. First, we have Susanna Capelouto, news director for GPB. Next, Errin Haines, a reporter for the Associated Press. And our third panelist is Walter Jones, Atlanta Bureau Chief for Morris News. Now let's get started with the debate. In the first round, each candidate will be asked 2 questions by our panelists. The candidates have 60 seconds to answer each question, and by random selection, John Stone gets the first question, and it comes from Susanna Capelouto.
Good evening, Mr. Stone.
Good evening.
Do you believe there are human causes for global warming, and would you vote for measures aimed at reducing man-made causes of global warming?
I believe global warming is part of a natural process in the world's climate. I think it's gone on before. And I would vote to do what we can to clean up our air. I don't think we necessarily have to look at human causes for global warming. I think we all agree, however, that we need to reduce air pollution as much as possible. We don't need to get into that global warming debate in order to do that, to move forward aggressively on cleaning up our air.
Thank you very much. Errin Haines, you may now ask your question of John Barrow.
Mr. Barrow, I'm wondering if you could tell us, where do you see the country in 2 years?
Gosh, I don't know where I see it. I hope that by that time we'll have made substantial progress on the energy front and the health care fronts, because despite the preoccupation we have with the economic meltdown right now in the financial services sector of the economy, clearly the things that have been gnawing away at the middle class for too long now has been the exploding cost of health care and the cost of health insurance, our failure as a country to deliver the highest quality health care in the world on terms that folks can get at it, especially in our part of the country. So making progress on health care, I think that enacting legislation like my SHOP Act, which I introduced in Congress, which would solve fix what's broke really with the small business health insurance market, can get a lot of people to kick in for the cost of the health care. On the energy front, I hope we'll have time to answer more questions about that. We need to get serious about developing alternatives. I agree we have to drill for as long as we can, as much as we can, as far as the eye can see. We've got to develop alternatives, because that's the only way we're going to get our kids out of the fix that we're cruising for right now. We need to develop energy alternatives.
Now, Walter Jones will ask John Stone a question.
Mr. Stone, kind of playing on the topic that Congressman introduced about health care, what is your view on what health care policy should be?
Health care policy, number one, we can make some immediate changes and immediate improvements in taking care of the 47 million uninsured if we reach across the aisle and put together some bipartisan reform. One issue that I think we can tackle and we can make an immediate improvements on, and it's particularly significant for people here in Georgia, is providing quality health insurance for folks with pre-existing health conditions. Our state, unfortunately, is one of more than half the states in the country that don't do anything for people with pre-existing health conditions who want to buy their own insurance, who can afford an affordable policy, but simply are being turned down by health insurers. If we create a national health high-risk health plan, like the one set up by the National Association of Insurance Commissioners as a model plan, we can provide affordable quality health insurance for a number of folks with pre-existing conditions that have been turned down at an affordable rate without costing the taxpayers any additional money at the federal level. It's an exciting plan. It's one we should be able to get both sides to agree to if we simply put together a bipartisan consensus.
And our final question in the first round comes from Susanna Capelouto, and it goes to John Barrow.
Mr. Barrow, you voted against a $700 billion rescue package, bailout, whatever you want to call it. And in that doing so, you sided with Georgia's 7 House Republicans. So I wanted to find out why you opposed it.
Well, I'm not going to speak for anybody else. You take 8 members of Congress to vote against it. It might be for 8 different reasons. I can tell you why I voted against it. I voted against it because it was too much downside for the taxpayer and not enough upside for the economy. It was essentially a $700 billion line of credit on a program to be named later by the administration. They still haven't figured out what they're going to do. That isn't the worst of it, though. There were several significant areas of fraud, waste, and abuse in the financial services sector that have come to light in the public mind in the last decade or so. Golden parachutes, foreign investors laundering their losses in our economic in our economy. Taxpayer protection provisions that the Blue Dogs that I work with came up with that would have guaranteed the taxpayers would have been stuck with any of the losses in this if we should have any losses. All of those provisions had language that we drew up to work into this program that would have effectively dealt with those problems and kept them out of this bailout. At the insistence of the Bush administration, they were negotiated right out of there. So when you know you got those problems to deal with, you can't address effectively. I couldn't support something when I know that there's too much downside for the taxpayer and not enough upside for the economy.
Congressman Barrow, thanks very much. And that concludes round 1. And it's now time for our candidates to ask each other 2 questions, alternating. You have 15 seconds for the question. You got 60 seconds to respond and 30 seconds for a rebuttal. And by random selection, John Barrow will ask the first question of John Stone. Mr. Barrow.
Okay, thank you. John, in the last debate we had in Savannah, you indicated that you weren't ready to vote on legislation that would force OSHA to regulate the problem of combustible dust in our industrial economy. You said you wanted to wait until the investigation of that particular incident is over. When is enough is enough? When are you prepared as a member of Congress to tell OSHA to do its job?
Well, John, number one, I think you did not address that problem correctly with your bill that you put forward. We had a problem in Savannah. The problem was enforcement. Your bill created new regulation. It did not go after the real problem with that sugar refinery explosion. We had regulations in place that were being violated over and over again without any decisive action being taken to correct it that caused that explosion. We need new legislation that deals with aggressive enforcement when there's a citation being issued. If it's not being followed, we need to step in and stop the situation. Your bill didn't cover that. More importantly, we had a lot of those folks that were injured in that explosion that were taken to the Joseph Still Burn Center in Augusta over a 2.5-hour drive on 2-lane roads where we've been trying to build an interstate for the last 4 years that you have blocked over and over again when all you had to do was co-sponsor the bill. We've got to move this district forward. We can't have the kind of partisan bickering that we're having. It's time to stop blocking the things we need for our district and start moving forward with solutions to problems that address the real problem instead of just additional regulation.
Mr. Stone, thanks very much. Congressman Barrow, you have 30 seconds.
The problem is with the regulations we've got on the books. What we've got are ineffective regulations that are mandatory and effective regulations that are voluntary and optional. John's approach to this is put a cop on every single shift and every single warehouse and everything manufacturing facility in the country. That will never work. What you fail to recognize is we have essentially a self-policing policy in this country where employers who want to do the right thing will do the right thing if you tell them what to do. We have regulations that have been on the books for 60 years that can solve this problem. And as long as we continue to look the other way while the bad regulations are the ones that folks have the option of choosing, folks are going to get hurt.
Thank you very much. And now Mr. Stone gets to ask John Barrow his first question.
Mr. Barrow, you say that the reason you ran 4 years ago is that the country was going in the wrong direction. Now, 4 years later, you say things have gotten worse. Yeah. Are you willing to accept the responsibility for your bad votes and lack of action on interstates, our energy prices, and our lack of loss of jobs in this district to global trade after you've switched your trade policy?
Well, I appreciate you giving me responsibility for everything that's been going on in the last 4 years, 2 of which have been while Bush and his crowd have been in charge of both the Congress and the White House, and the last 2 of which while the president's been in charge of the entire executive branch of government. If you can help me understand the specific votes that you think have gotten our ox in the ditch, I'll tell you, I'll be happy to accept responsibility for that. But I'm voting for change every chance I get. I think it's essential to understand what it is that's gotten us in this situation in the first place. Our federal fiscal house is in disorder because we aren't balancing the federal checkbook. The financial marketplace is a disaster right now because we've taken the cop off the beat. The deregulators are in charge. They have been in charge for too long now. What we need to do is fix what's broke with our federal budget, and that's where pay-go rules come into place. We need to fix what's broke in the financial services sector by putting the cop back on the beat so that banks that are supposed to be making safe loans that will be paid back, and investment banks that are basically casino operations making bets, are on different sides of the street, and folks know where their assets are going when they deal with each one.
Mr. Barrow, thanks very much. And Mr. Stone, you have 30 seconds
Our
to rebut.
economy is in a shambles because we've had a Congress that for 25 years has sold out this country to global special interests again and again, both Democrat and Republican, again and again. And you've gone up there in your 4 years and you've sold us out too. Let me talk about leadership. Here's what we need to do in this district. And in the first year that I'm in office, Lord willing, if I get elected, here's what I will do. I will introduce legislation to drill here, drill now, expand our energy resources, and go for energy independence in 10 years. I'll vote to expand every form of alternative energy and introduce
And you may have to hold
legislation.
off on that till a later point because
interstates.
We're out of time for your rebuttal. But now it's time for the second question of John Barrow for John Stone.
John, what specific legislation would you propose to deal with problems besetting the veterans community in this country?
Number one, I would vote for mandatory funding of veterans benefits. And that's an issue that I think after the Congress passed that awful $700 billion bailout, it's one that if we can afford to throw that much money at a problem, by golly, we can afford to back up our veterans. 100% with mandatory funding as an entitlement with the same level of funding that we provide for Social Security and Medicare. Secondly, we need to expand outpatient veteran clinics around our district, both in Statesboro and Milledgeville, all across, so that veterans have better access. And we need to build those new interstates so our veterans have a better way to get in for treatment when they need it. And that's been something that's been left on the drawing board. As I said, in my first year in office, if I'm elected, I will revive that plan, not just to build the new interstates, but to add light commuter rail so that we develop mass transit in the 12th District, which is slated to get more growth than any other district in Georgia over the next 20 years. We have to move forward. We have to move forward on our veterans, and we got to give them 100% of their funding. We've got to do it in a mandatory way.
Mr. Barrow, you've got 30 seconds to rebut.
Those are good ideas, and I don't disagree with them. But I'll also add that we need to do what this Congress has done to basically bring back the GI Bill, the new GI Bill for the 21st century. I was proud to have been a part of the team that passed that. Also proud to have been a part of the team that passed the largest increase in federal spending for veterans benefits in the 77-year history of the VA. But in addition to that specific legislation, I got the veterans disability mileage reimbursement rate passed, first increase in 30 years, got it doubled. Now I got enough money to triple it. Also, I've introduced legislation that will fix what's broke with the disability determination system in the VA. We ought to empower doctors to tell the VA who's entitled to the benefits and who isn't. They don't operate that way now, and my bill is something we need to work on in the next Congress.
Mr. Barrow, thank you very much. And that is almost the end of our second round. I apologize. Mr. Stone, didn't want to leave you out there. You may now ask your second question of Mr. Barrow.
Thank you. Mr. Barrow, you say you changed your mind on the Peru trade deal because it was, quote, mutually enforceable in one of our earlier debates this week. Can you explain, as a Harvard trial attorney, how a Georgia worker can enforce their minimum wage rights against competitors in Peru who pay 65 cents an hour? How is that mutually enforceable?
Well, first off, I want to correct what you said before about the fact that I voted for all these free trade agreements. I want you to understand something. I voted against the Singapore Free Trade Agreement. I voted against the Oman Free Trade Agreement. I voted against the Colombia Free Trade Agreement because they were all written by Bush and his crowd that had all kinds of nods and winks toward mandating and enforcing environmental and labor standards, but they were practically enforceable. Only the government could sue, and the government could sue in a form that couldn't provide any relief. The Peru Free Trade Agreement is different in this respect. It hadn't been written by Bush and his crowd. It had the support of labor and of management and of the Chamber of Commerce. I stood up to the Chamber of Commerce on all of these other votes, but here's one where both sides had a chance to come to the table and actually draft agreements where management, labor organizations, injured competitors in our country have standing to bring claims. They didn't have that before. And that's what's missing in our free trade agreements. If you haven't got a trade agreement that can be enforced by somebody, by anybody, it ain't a fair trade agreement. And if it ain't a fair trade agreement, it's not a free trade agreement.
Thanks, Mr. Barrow. Mr. Stone, you've got 30 seconds.
The truth of the matter is labor unions and the Chamber of Commerce came to the table with over $300,000 in money for your campaign. which has accepted over 90% of your campaign funds have come from special interest groups out of Washington and individuals outside our district. And I think that sets a record here. What happened is you took the money from the chamber, you took the money from the unions, you changed your votes, and you sold out Georgia labor and you sold out Georgia workers. Here's what I'll do in that first year. I will vote to repeal the Peru trade agreement, CAFTA, NAFTA, MFN for China, and replace them with fair trade policies that will give Georgia a level playing field with foreign competition.
And your time is up, Mr. Stone. Thank you very much. And that concludes our second round of questioning. For our third round, we return to our panel of journalists who will ask questions of the candidate of his or her choice. The candidates will be allowed 1 minute to respond, and as moderator, I will determine if the opposing candidate will be given 30 seconds for rebuttal. We begin this round of questioning with a question from Errin Haines.
Gentlemen, both of you mentioned alternative energy solutions, and I'm wondering to hear from both of you about whether or not you're in favor of drilling off of Georgia's coast and building nuclear power plants here.
Okay, and Ms. Haynes, will you just say which one you'd like to go first?
Mr. Barrow, you can answer first.
I am in favor of expanding our country's reliance on nuclear energy, and I'm a big supporter of expanding the nuclear energy plant at Plant Vogtle. We got the last 2 cells to come online in this country at Plant Vogtle, and the next 2, with my support, will come online there at Plant Vogtle, because we need that as a part of the mix, a part of the portfolio of energy sources going into the energy feed, into the energy grid, the electrical energy grid. I do support responsible offshore drilling. I think Katrina and Rita taught us that this can be done. In fact, it taught us that industry basically caught up with problems we'd experienced in the 1970s. That's why I stood up to members in my party who are basically fighting the same old environmental battles they were fighting back in the 1970s when I voted in the last Congress for Congressman Jindal's bill, he's now the governor of Louisiana, for his bill that would have opened up offshore drilling on responsible terms and conditions all across the coast. That's why I voted for the Drill Act in this Congress. That's why I was a co-author of the Abercrombie-Peterson bill, the bill that the Republican leadership endorsed as the bipartisan solution, would remove the moratorium and redirected the royalties toward developing alternative energy sources.
Mr. Barrow, thanks very much. And we also wanted to give a minute to Mr. Stone, because I believe that question was directed to both of you.
That is, and thank you. Yes, I believe we should drill offshore. We should drill in Anwar in Alaska. We should develop every form of alternative energy known to man that we can look at. We know some will work, some might not work, but we've got to expand and do research into everything we possibly can, including mass transit and better transportation for our district. But I need to point out my opponent here just mentioned that he voted for these things. He also voted against them 25 times, voted against drilling offshore, drilling in Alaska, building new refineries, building new reactors, so that he can tell people on one side of the aisle, I supported you, I voted against it, while telling folks on the other side, no, I supported you, I voted for it. It's called gaming your votes. And when you game your votes, it means that your words mean nothing, your votes do nothing, and our district gets nothing. And that's what we've had for 4 years here in Washington. We have to expand our energy resources. You look at those 25 votes, all 25 votes posted on our website, I would have voted exactly opposite my opponent. There's a clear distinction between us. You can look at it and see the difference.
All right, Mr. Barrow, since he mentioned you, we get 30 seconds to rebut.
Well, I took him up on his offer and looked at the 25 votes he's been touting for the last year or so, and I found they got nothing to do with drilling offshore or otherwise. Their procedural motions on substantive bills got nothing to do with drilling. If you take a motion to end debate and set the terms for debate on the Farm Bill, on the 2009 National Defense Authorization Bill, on the NASA Authorization Bill, on the Paycheck Fairness Act, on the Stop Child Abuse Act. When you take all of those and say those are votes against drilling, it's clear what's happening here. The new method of accounting is any vote for anything else the government's interested in is a vote against offshore drilling. On the substantive votes that matter, right, I voted for offshore drilling.
Mr. Stone, quickly, 30 seconds.
I'll make it quick. Don't believe either one of us. Go to our website, www.johnstoneforcongress.com. You will find a link to the clerk of the House on every one of those 25 votes. Some were procedural, some were actually on specific bills dealing with those measures, and you'll find out which of us was telling the truth. Check it out. You'll find that he voted against specific measures to build new refineries, specific standalone bills to drill offshore and drill in Alaska, along with procedural votes.
Right, now the next question. Next question is from Walter Jones. And again, Mr. Jones, tell us of whom you're asking the question.
Thank you. Mr. Stone, this is for you. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce has endorsed Congressman Barrow. And I want to know, doesn't that get in the way of you trying to portray yourself as kind of the pro-business candidate in this race?
You know, I don't think it does in this case, because the reason the chamber endorsed my opponent is they gave him $15,000 in PAC money for changing his vote on the Peru trade deal, and then they have purchased I don't know how many tens of thousands of dollars of special interest advertising supporting him in this campaign as a result of that vote. I love our local chamber, and it's interesting that my opponent, when he was running, called his local chamber of commerce slumlords. He's gone to Washington 4 years later, he's in bed with them and taken tens of thousands of dollars of special interest money to support an agenda that hurts Georgia workers, that hurts our economy. When we look at the economic problems that we face right now in this country, we have a tendency to look at the mortgage crisis or the gas crisis or the bailout separately. The problem is that working folks in this country can no longer afford a decent standard of living, to where they can't afford a decent house because their wages have been driven down by globalism, pushed by the chamber, NFIB, and those other organizations. This is about selling out to Washington special interest. I'm glad not to have that money so I can stand for the people of this district.
Mr. Barrow, you've got 30 seconds to rebut.
If I have the chamber's support, and it's something I'm proud of, is because they recognize that a responsible legislature who will dig into the weeds and actually try and reconcile the differences between folks when they can be reconciled is someone who's worth getting behind. I'm proud to have their support. I stood up to them when it came to the dust bill, stood up to them when it came to the bailout, stood up to them when it came to all of those free trade agreements that I recited that I voted against. The important thing here is to recognize that even folks that don't support you most of the time, or that you don't tend to agree with most of the time, they've got something to contribute to the debate. And if you'll work with them, you can make a lot of progress on legislation. That's my reputation.
Mr. Barrow, thanks a lot. Susanna Capelouto, it is your turn to ask a question.
Mr. Barrow, I want to set up a little hypothetical. Let's assume Barack Obama wins the election, and he goes forth with his tax increase for people who make over $250,000. He can't do so without the support of Congress. As a Blue Dog Democrat, where do you stand on this?
I stand by the pay-go rules, which are put back in the House rules as a result of the efforts of the group that I belong to and that I work with, the Blue Dog Coalition, the fiscally conservative block of members of my caucus who are concerned about trying to make sure that our federal government balances its budget. Listen, those rules were directly responsible for balancing the federal budget in the last decade. I know a lot of folks can find it hard to believe that that was even possible, but it happened just 10 years ago. We had 4 years running of surplus when the federal government was actually beginning to pay down the accumulated debt that it had picked up over the last couple of hundred years as a result of a rule that said basically you cannot add new spending into the federal budget unless you come up either with new revenues or you cut the cost someplace else in order to make up the cost of the new program dollar for dollar. The pay-go rules are what got our ox out of the ditch in the 1990s. It'll be necessary for us to use that again. That's the only thing that's worked in the past. A word of caution, though, it's going to be harder for us this time around because our ox is further in the ditch now than it was 10 years ago. When Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich were working this thing out, things weren't nearly as bad as they are now.
So would you then support, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Would you then support the tax increase?
I'll give you just 30 seconds here.
I don't know what kind of tax increases we're going to be offered. I do not know what the options will be. I can tell you this, though. There are many provisions of the Bush tax cuts that benefit middle-class folks, working-class folks. It's a grab bag. And it's important, folks, to realize there are things in there that are worth preserving. There are things in there that were sold as job creators. And if on the record they've done that, they deserve to be continued. If on the record they haven't, we need to look someplace else.
We're real short of time here, and before we get to closing statements, Mr. Stone, I want to give you at least 30 seconds to respond.
I would like to respond to that. I don't support any tax increase. I think the wrong thing we can do for our economy right now is to put additional taxes on it and drive the economy down further. We have to stimulate growth in the economy, and to do that we need to repeal that awful bailout package that Congress, the Democratic Congress I might add, along with both our presidential candidates, which was very disappointing to me, just passed. We need a real bailout plan, one like we unveiled in Savannah this last week with world-renowned economist Dr. Pat Choate, that takes the foreclosures off the market and keeps people in their homes. That week will do more good for the economy than any tax increase.
Thank you, Mr. Stone. And we have no more time for questions, unfortunately. Both candidates for the 12th Congressional District, though, will have 30 seconds each for a closing statement. John Stone was randomly selected to make the first statement. Mr. Stone, thank you.
Thank you. This is a great day to be an American if we have the courage to reject the Washington special interests that have sold out this country. We can repeal and replace that bailout with a common sense plan that gets our economy back on track. We can expand gas production and work for American energy independence in 10 years if we have the courage to do so. We can restart the interstate projects that my opponent has blocked here in our district and add light rail for future mass transit for our district. And most importantly, we need to restore our principles of God and country in this country that we've lost over the last 25 years. I ask for your vote. God bless each of you, and good night.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stone. Mr. Barrow, you have time for your closing statement, 30 seconds.
Thank you. In my almost 4 years in Congress, I've earned a reputation as someone who can work with folks on both sides of the aisle and all sides of the issue in order to find solutions to the problems that are facing the folks back home. Now, I do that because it's the only way to get things done in Washington. It's also what I genuinely believe this country needs, and I know it's what the vast majority of the voters I represent say they want in their representative. If that's the kind of representation you want, then I ask for your vote, and I'd be proud to have your support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barrow. And that concludes our debate. We would like to remind voters that the general election is going to be held on Tuesday, November 4th. Our thanks to both of these candidates and to our panel of journalists. And we'd also like to thank the Atlanta Press Club for arranging tonight's debate. For more information about the Atlanta Press Club, you may visit www.atlantapressclub.org, and this debate will be archived on the Press Club's website. I'm Denis O'Hare. Thank you for joining us for this 2008 election debate.
This program was funded in part by a grant from the late Tom Watson Brown and by supporters of Georgia Public Broadcasting. Thank you.